As crazy as it sounds, it has been almost 1.5 months since Metroid Prime Remastered was revealed at the last Nintendo Direct, and as we all know, Shadow dropped online immediately following that presentation, which gave all of us a chance to run online, download and purchase that game, and start experiencing the incredibleness that is Metroid Prime Remastered. This was an amazing, wonderful thing that gave us all a great chance to celebrate the excellence of Metroid Prime, which, as many of you know, is my favorite game of all time, and I could not have been more thrilled with what I was seeing happening in front of my eyes. In fact, if you watched my reaction clip that I did, of course, post on my channel, you saw how completely shocked I was by the fact that this existed, and the fact that it wasn't just an actual HD polish and a re-release of the same game. They remade all of the visual assets of that game and made it look so incredibly modern and beautiful and borderline next gen that they just couldn't have done a better job with it. I was so thrilled about everything they did with that game, as were most people, which, as we know, led to it being incredibly successful. The buzz and the conversation online was just so astronomically positive. It had everyone focused on Metroid again and talking about Metroid Prime and excited for the future of this franchise. Now, of course, a couple of weeks ago, I also made another follow-up video regarding Metroid Prime Remastered, talking about the sales potential for the game, because as we started to see some signs about how the game was performing in terms of physical game sales, and the initial reports were, of course, coming out of the UK, to be fair. But some of those early signs were showing us that this game was performing extremely well. Again, in terms of sales. And so when you factor in all of the hype and the fervor around trying to get our hands on physical copies of this game, which of course released a few weeks after the digital copy, and then the insane number of people who obviously went and downloaded it the day that it shadow dropped, it was worth me discussing that we might be seeing a situation where potentially Metroid Prime Remastered, the remastered Nintendo Switch, and I like to call it remastered, sort of remade, right, because of the way the visuals look, but the remastered version, 2023, of Metroid Prime could end up being the best-selling Metroid game of all time, which would be a monumental feat because less than 2 years ago, Metroid Dread released as a brand new game on the Nintendo Switch, and that took only 6 months to become the best-selling Metroid game of all time, and who knows where it's made it to since then. I mean, I think it's probably sitting around 3.2 to 3.5 million copies sold at this point. And I truly think because of Nintendo's surprisingly brilliant decision to shadow drop this game as well as give a physical release a few weeks later, really aided in the excitement for everyone to want to get their hands on this game and experience it in a variety of ways. And when we just talk about the eventual sales total we'll see for this game, the fact that a lot of folks, including myself, will have chosen to double dip and download the digital copy but also purchase themselves a physical copy for their collection, it just means that we're really potentially seeing something monumental happen where a re-release of a game, a classic game in a long-running franchise, could end up outperforming every prior entry, including the original release of that same game. And now it has to be said, we're only talking specifically about the sales potential for the game right now, but there's another element, another milestone this game might also have a chance to hit this year, which speaks volumes about the popularity and longevity of Metroid Prime as a title and potentially the series, and of course the future success of the series, which we all know right now our sights are laser focused on Metroid Prime 4 whenever we find out anything about that game. But beyond the amazing sales success we know Metroid Prime Remastered is going to be seeing, it also might end up being the best reviewed game of 2023, which means, depending on how certain outlets or even the Game Awards show itself wants to consider a game that's called a remaster, it might even be the game of the year for 2023. And if that really happens, stop and think about how monumental of an achievement that could actually end up being. Now, it goes without saying that we are only halfway through March of 2023, right? We're halfway through the third month of the year, which means there is plenty of time to go for games with better review scores to still come out, and we know there are some massive banger titles in 2023 still yet to release. So it's definitely too early to call this race for Metroid Prime Remastered, but as we sit here in the first quarter of the year, and we've got a couple of very huge, high-reviewed games already releasing, it is worth noting and taking a look at what the current review situation looks like for Metroid Prime Remastered and its immediate competition. So obviously the first thing we want to do is just take a look at where all video games released in 2023 so far sit on Metacritic. And of course, Metacritic isn't the only barometer that matters when it comes to a game's quality or sales potential. We all know that. But when we just look at what's happening, let's take a look at, based on Metacritic scores, the amount of people that rated the game very highly out of a lot of reviews. What is the best reviewed game of the year so far? It's Metroid Prime Remastered. It is sitting at a 94. To my knowledge, pretty early on in its review scores, I believe it was sitting at a 95. And so as more review scores came in, it did end up sitting at a 94. But man, 94, that's incredible. So currently, Metroid Prime Remastered has 84 reviews under its belt to get itself to that 94 Metacritic score. 84 reviews is very significant. That's about what you want to see to know that you've got a significant swath of reviewers and an accurate final Metacritic score, right? If we were sitting at somewhere in the range of like maybe 10 to 15 or so reviews, especially considering it's an older game, which sometimes will happen for older games, that might not be the most accurate depiction of the final score and the overall consensus amongst reviewers. But with 84 reviews, which falls right in line for the standard number of reviews for most big AAA games on a site like Metacritic, yeah, we're looking at the legit real deal score, a 94 in the year of 2023, which is 21 years after the release of the original game on the GameCube. It is insane and so impressive and makes me so happy to see what this game is doing. Now, for direct comparison, before we look at other 2023 games, if you look at the original Metroid Prime released on the GameCube in 2002, again, 21 years ago, my favorite game of all time, that is sitting at a 97, so slightly better than Metroid Prime Remastered. I love to see it because it is my all-time favorite game. And that also includes 70 reviews, which in the modern era is pretty significant to get that many review scores for an old game that was released in the 6th generation. So across the board, we're just seeing evidence that Metroid Prime really is just known to be one of the greatest video games ever created in the history of the industry and in the history of the hobby across all platforms and all eras and all generations and all that stuff. It's just a masterpiece, which makes me very proud to call it my favorite game. Not like I needed high review scores to make a game my favorite game. It was my favorite game way before a site like Metacritic existed. I just love to see it because it just makes me happy, right? Because if it's your favorite game, you want to see it revered the same way that you feel about it. Now, the other significant piece to this, probably more significant, is comparing it to games that have already come out this year. And the reason this conversation is notable right now, today, and the reason I'm making this video, is because one of the other frontrunners for the best game of the year, the best reviewing and best selling game of the year, the Resident Evil 4 remake, just released, and we can see the best reviewed version of that game on the PlayStation 5 is sitting at a 93. And so ironically, we're looking at two 6th generation GameCube games that have had remastered, remake, re-release versions come out in 2023, early in 2023 to be fair, both with staggeringly good reviews, coming in at very high scores on Metacritic, 94 and 93 respectively. It's amazing, and it's great because these two games are literally two games in my top 5 all time, right? Metroid Prime on the GameCube is my favorite game of all time, followed very closely by Resident Evil 4. That's probably sitting around my number 3 or 4 game of all time. It really is a masterpiece, and I'm so excited to play the remake this coming week. And so that was one of the stiffest competition games against Metroid Prime Remastered so far, was Resident Evil 4. And we're seeing that while it's done incredibly well for itself, and to be fair, it still also could end up being considered the game of the year when all is said and done, even with a 93 score, look at what we're seeing here. So far, nothing this year has been able to top the re-release and remaster of a 20-year-old game. It's incredible. Now, of course, there are a couple of really big caveats when we talk about whether or not Metroid Prime Remastered, when December 31st of this year rolls around, will Metroid Prime Remastered be considered the Game of the Year? Will it win Game of the Year awards on a lot of sites like an IGN or a GameSpot? Could it possibly be nominated and win Game of the Year at the Game Awards at the end of the year? I mean, maybe, but again, there are caveats that kind of impact how this could actually play out. And I think that maybe one of the most immediate ones we think of, is the fact that it's a remaster, right? Remaster, remake, we know it kind of straddles that line, but it is using the base source code of the game, right? The same animations, the same world and build out. And so it is, and it's got remaster in the title, right? So whether it's a remaster or remake, it is a re-release of an old game. And because of that, there's a chance that a lot of different outlets, including the Game Awards in December, may not qualify it for Game of the Year. Or you might even have your own personal preference to not qualify it for Game of the Year. And if I'm being honest, it pains me to say it because this is my favorite game of all time, but I kind of understand that. And if I'm being real, even though it will make me sad, if the Game Awards comes around in December and Metroid Prime Remastered doesn't qualify to be nominated, I'm going to understand it. And honestly, I won't even blame anyone. I'm not going to blame the Game Awards or Jeff Keighley. I won't blame websites or YouTube channels that decide not to count this game because they feel like it straddles a weird enough of a line to not be considered a 2023 release. I certainly do, and yes, I'm biased because I'm a Metroid Prime fanboy, but at least I can admit that. So I'm willing to count it, and I already know this is going to be the best game that released in 2023. There's no doubt in my mind for me and my tastes and my list, this is it, man, Metroid Prime Remastered. But I think that it's fair for other outlets and things like the Game Awards to say that this game doesn't qualify. So if we see that happen, we're going to know why, and it's not going to make me upset. And what's the other main reason why it might be too early to say that Metroid Prime Remastered will be the game of the year of 2023? Well, it's because we know there's a couple of really badass and huge games we still know to expect. Again, we're only in March, man. We have 9 more months to go once March is over, right? There's a lot of time for a lot of games to come out and potentially review better or be seen as better in the eyes of most people than Metroid Prime Remastered. It's not going to be the case for me, but it is certainly something worth considering, right? A couple of games that jump right to my head when I think about games that have a chance at maybe having higher Metacritic scores or being seen as Game of the Year if Metroid Prime Remastered doesn't count would be Starfield on the Xbox Series X, which finally just got a confirmed release date for September. I am massively excited for this game. I know it's going to be great, and I think that has a chance at maybe being a Game of the Year contender. There is, of course, Spider-Man 2 on the PlayStation 5 coming out, I think, this summer, and I also cannot wait for that. I know it's going to be absolutely incredible. There is Star Wars Jedi Survivor, which to me, as a huge Star Wars fan, is definitely a front-runner for a Game of the Year contender, and I think will be amazing. And then, of course, a small little game you might have heard of called The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. Now, all of these games, including the Resident Evil 4 remake, by the way, are absolutely games on the table to potentially have either higher Metacritic scores than Metroid Prime Remastered or just win Game of the Year for a variety of reasons. Maybe Metroid Prime Remastered isn't counted, or maybe if all of the scores end up as a tie, just more folks feel like one of these other games is a better game than Metroid, and that's fine if that ends up happening. But when it comes to Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, I think that as much as Spider-Man, Starfield, and Jedi Survivor I think are going to be just incredible frontrunner games, Zelda really is probably the biggest game releasing in the industry this year because it's Zelda, because it's a sequel to Breath of the Wild, which itself was the Game of the Year winner back in 2017, one of the best reviewed games of all time itself, and it's Zelda. Like I already said, that's kind of all it needs to be. It's a mainline Zelda game, and I mean, Zelda is my second favorite franchise of all time. Breath of the Wild is another game in my top 5 all-time games. And so I think Tears of the Kingdom is going to be incredible. I've spoken about it many times on videos so far this year because it's a big thing happening in just a couple of months. And so we look at the situation with Metroid Prime Remastered. We look at the incredible reviews, the incredible reception, the incredible scores, and the Metacritic total, the fact that the sales are obviously going to be through the roof. And it's like, yeah, this game, if it's considered in the Game of the Year conversation, even though it's considered a remaster, it absolutely could be Game of the Year. But you've got Zelda coming out in a couple of months. We've got a huge new Star Wars game. We've got Spider-Man 2. And there's probably even another, Diablo 4 is another massive game coming out this year that could be the best game of the year. Resident Evil 4 Remake itself in the conversation, even with a 93 score. So there's a lot of competition for Metroid Prime Remastered, so it's just going to come down to how everything else stacks up against this game as the year plays out. For me, like I said, I'm kind of moving around my personal standards for the sake of Metroid Prime Remastered, because in prior years, When a game like Zelda Wind Waker came out on the Wii U, for example, that was probably my favorite game of that year, but at the time, I chose not to kind of count it in my top 10 games of the year, I believe, because I was like, it's a port, and it's a remaster, and it's not really a new game. Metroid Prime Remastered, I'm willing to kind of change my outlook for two reasons. One is my fanboy reason that I'm willing to admit. I'm biased because it's my favorite game of all time. Two is the fact that I do think this game goes beyond just a standard remaster. A game like Twilight Princess Remastered, or Twilight Princess HD and Wind Waker HD, those really were more true remasters. There was a little bit more remaking stuff happening with Wind Waker, I believe, but in general, they were kind of just HD ports with some minor enhancements. Metroid Prime Remastered, they went way above and beyond just remastering the game and giving it an HD polish, right? They did change some architecture. They did add some things. They did change some enemy behaviors. And they remade the overall visual assets of the game incredibly. I mean, they went so far with it. So those two reasons, one is a fanboy bias pick, the other I think is a legitimate, quantifiable reason. I'm willing to say Metroid Prime Remastered is in my personal conversation for Game of the Year and to be considered a 2023 release, the same way I feel about Resident Evil 4. And so I know that there's no way that any game, not even Zelda, is going to be better than Metroid Prime Remastered for me because it's my favorite game and I don't see any game surpassing it. Probably not even Metroid Prime 4. So anyway, this is what I see. This is the landscape of gaming in 2023, what we can expect the rest of the year, where Metroid Prime Remastered sits right now, and it'll be fascinating and an incredible achievement for this game and its legacy if 21 years after the original release, the remastered re-release becomes the game of the year across the industry. If the Game Awards and IGN and places like it consider it in the conversation, it's got a legitimate chance at being the game of the year for 2023. And boy, we'll be having a lot of fun conversations about this title if that ends up happening at the end of the year. So only time will tell what happens with this game.